Porter from UCLA, who is in fact my former PhD advisor and a fantastic mentor, is going to be giving this really great talk on data ethics starting right now.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know, I'll try to give a really great talk, but anyway, the fantastic mentor part is what means the most to me today, no matter how much I screw up. This is my buddy. It will show up later at some point. Just want to set the right tone for the talk. That's why we're all here today. Okay, so there's a lot of people who know a lot more about data ethics than me. I will hopefully give you an introduction and point you to them, give you stuff to think about, some of which we'll think about over the next few days. But now that Al has introduced complex systems, especially complex social systems, then these will be things that you want to think about when you're working with them. Okay, so I don't want to go through much detail on the acknowledgements, but some versions of this slide have run through some comments from other people, and I'm going to give a reference list on the next slide. There is an older slide deck which has a couple other slides, or a couple variant slides that's available for people who are interested. It's geared towards a slightly different audience, but there's a little bit of other stuff there. Okay, so before I give some pointers to some websites, I want to show you something that will partly gear the sort of broad overview of types of topics that one could do, some small subset of which will be here, but also towards discussions on ethics courses that one might design, or data science majors, or things along those lines. And we have a new data theory major at UCLA, and there's a new course, although it's not, I think it's not been offered yet. I couldn't find it on our website, but this is about data and society. So this blurb was written by Mark Hancock, who is my colleague in statistics. And I can't promise that this will be the final version of the course or anything like that, but just a course directly on societal impacts of data. And of course, it also makes sense to bring these up whenever you have data intensive courses of other forms, but to have also a designated course where you really go through and do a deep dive. And so this blurb is one that is sort of what we're thinking of putting in it. And it's not just a matter of privacy and replicability, but also how things interact with society, right? So like things like algorithmic bias and so on, you can expect would and should be in a course like that. Okay, so that's just something to think about, since I know there are various people who are interested in designing or doing data science majors of different types. Okay, some resources. People who know more than me, much more than me. So I encourage you to look through them. The first one I'm going to bring up is by Casey Fiesler. And what she did is that she actually collected a bunch of ethics curricula. So there's a Medium post, and then there's a link to an Excel file that has a collection. And I don't know exactly how current it is, so I can't promise that there aren't things from the last couple of years that are there. This post is from a couple of years ago. But just to see which universities are offering different things and which topics and how they're gearing it as far as what's available. And I'm sure many of those courses also have a lot of things, that a lot of resources that are available to the public. A couple of them that I've looked at in more detail, well, okay, 2 out of the 3 in more detail, but Matt Salganic has a course from fall 2016. Some bits of it ended up getting put into his book. And I actually took some slides with his permission from some ethics slides that he has on this course. So he has a bunch of public stuff, so you can take a look there. Another person who has a lot of public information and who tweets about this and has a lot of very insightful threads of various issues, very active, is Rachel Thomas. So in addition to her tweets, the hyperlink I have is actually to her pinned tweet, because that has hyperlinks for her various courses and talks and blogs and so on. So that's another set of resources that hopefully will be very useful for people. And then another one that has influenced me is Johan Ugander has a website about data privacy, and again, you can find a bunch of his resources there. So these are all people who know much more than me, and I encourage you very strongly to look at things that they have posted and stuff that they're putting in their courses and things that they're encouraging you to read, and a couple of those will show up at some point. Okay, if you click on those websites, however, as I learned yesterday when preparing this, I suddenly started getting advertisements for their universities and different programs at them. So somehow that data itself is being used and is somehow part of this whole discussion. Okay, So why discuss it? Well, first of all, it's important, right? I mean, I showed you a description on societal impacts of data, right? And so that's one reason, although not the only reason that it's important. From a more sort of generic scientific level, people need to be able to replicate the work. The notion of replication in a social system is going to get interesting. They need to make sure their own code is correct. There's a natural self-correction, and they need to know what choices we make, right? So in the last talk, Al was talking about choices that she was making with the data, and those choices, of course, have ethical ramifications, but even in addition to the ethical ramifications, people have to know the choices we make, even just to do things in a neutral scientific way, in addition to the ramifications. This is not a traditional part of the mathematical training, but as we use more and more data, and this goes for computer scientists and physicists and so on as well, and we're using social data, including potentially personal data, we need to have this training. And the training is much more familiar to people who come from sociology and other disciplines. And so we're behind the curve, and unfortunately being behind the curve can cause bad things to happen. And so we need to catch up. Okay, so we use a lot more data. I'm gearing this talk more towards human data, but a bunch of stuff also applies to animal data. And again, other disciplines have thought a lot more about this than we have, partly because there have been some famous errors, like some of Stanley Milgram's his was the electric shock experiment, the Stanford prison guard experiment. There have been some famous things why internal review boards now exist. But there's been some practices that have been developed, and those are things that we can learn from. And then thanks to my colleague, Peter Mucka, when I showed him this slide without this quote, he reminded me of a quote from All of Me by Steve Martin. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to take some stuff from Matt Salganik's slides, slightly altered on occasion. So things that are important to do. So be honest and fair, and yes, it's obvious, but we should still say it. We still should do it. Design ethically thoughtful research. Explain your decisions to others. So 2 and 3 are the ones that I got from Matt's slides. Now, different people may come up with different decisions, right? People may disagree with each other, but you still need to think about it carefully to do it. Okay, so 4 principles, again, drawn from Matt's slides, which you can find on his website. So respect for persons, again, I'm thinking of social research, but there are animal versions of this as well. Beneficence, justice, respect for law and public interest. And they're going to be in tension. Some of these principles are going to be in tension with each other. So it's not that you're going to be able to say, okay, I'm going to satisfy all 4 of them perfectly. That will not always be possible. And so there's going to be some notion of balance and when you should do something and when you should maybe not do something and so on. Okay. All right, so again, there's something obvious. You need to be honest about your work, which most people are, but we still read about some of these things that make you gasp. Okay, so permission to undertake a study in the first place. Now this is a lower bound, keep in mind, right? Legal permission is a lower bound, but that you start there. So if you're working with personal data, in the US, they're institutional review boards, IRBs. The acronyms and mechanisms are somewhat different in other countries. I'm blanking out on the UK acronym, but it's a different one. And what you do is that you give them your plan. If you're writing a grant proposal, you would actually show them normally before your grant proposal. You certainly show them before any of the relevant research starts. And they may tell you that you don't need a formal application, right? So you send a query, and they may tell you that you don't need a formal application. Or they may tell you that you can do an accelerated one, or they may tell you, okay, you need to really thoroughly go ahead and do this. What data do you have access to or plan to acquire it, what you plan to do with it. Different IRBs can rule differently. And in fact, say at my institution, which subset of the IRB at UCLA would look at something depends on what you're doing. Is it the social people who look at it? Is it the biological ones, and so on? As I mentioned, the rules are different in different countries, so the mechanisms. Human data is what I have in mind, but you have to worry about animal data and acquisition. Okay, I said this is UCLA's website, but you can click on I meant to adjust from UCLA websites for this, but each university has a program like this, which will give you hyperlinks as to which online service they use. And there's a bunch of them that are common that I'm gonna show just to give you an idea. But you go to these websites, and this will tell you who you're going to apply for, and also different training that you can take and different modules. And it starts with a sort of basic training, but then there are modules that can get much more specific, again, depending on what you're doing. Right, so you'll be required to do training, you'll be required to plan out what you're doing and submit your proposal. And they may ask you to change something, or they may ask you to give more justification, or they may just say no, and so on, right? So this is now for legal permission. And again, it's a floor, not a ceiling, right? You could, you should think about it yourself, saying, even if they gave me permission, do I want to do this? Should I do this? Okay, so this top one, city program, is a very heavily used program. I don't think it's the only one, but it's extremely common. What is required and expected and available is different in different countries. And one of the things that I found in the UK, so I was on the faculty at Oxford for almost a decade. And one of the things that I found is that their sort of ethics requirements, at least the legal ones, seem to be much more stringent for animals than I have found in the US. And their ethics requirement for human research was, at least as far as I could tell, much less stringent than what is legally required in the US. And I remember talking to a psychologist colleague of mine when I was first trying to figure out what the UK version of IRB was. And he's like, oh, we don't do that. I'm like, okay. So it's odd. You can have strange differences depending on where you are. All right, so it's important to do it anyway, right? I know a lot of people from the mathematical sciences who do social research might be looking at models and might be only using data in a minimal way, right? But you can also use data in a much more heavily involved way. I actually work with psychologists and with neuroscientists and so on. And so, I've had to go very far beyond the basic training for some of those projects, because we're literally, people are going into fMRI machines, we're doing surveys in the student dorms, right? We have to work with the dorms. And so we have to say in advance, okay, here are the things that we're doing. And then they'll say, okay, well, you can do this as long as you are careful about X, Y, Z, and you do training, this, right? So there's a whole bunch of legal stuff before you even get to the sort of personal and societal ethical stuff of what am I think is okay to do in the first place. Okay, so looking a little bit at some of these city program courses, this is a website snapshot from a couple of years ago, so I can't promise it looks exactly the same right now. But they have different ones that you can do. So animal care and use, I'm guessing that will be less relevant for most of us here, although I know there's some mathematical biologists who are at the course. Biosafety and biosecurity. Human subjects research. So this one is going to be one of the big ones for many projects that are related to the stuff that we're talking about, right? So there's going to be a lot of stuff on human subjects. Getting data from something online is still human subjects, right? It's not the sort of classical one of the old psychological experiments from half a century ago, right? So, you start crawling data from Twitter, what's public and what's not public can get thorny. Information privacy and security is another one that I would expect many people with these sorts of projects to really be looking at these different courses. And they're not long. The modules are not long. And at some level, many of them cover things that seem like common sense, but they do case studies and they force you to think about it. And I like the force you to think about it aspect of it. Keep track of time. Okay. So this is the human subjects research. You shouldn't read all of these things, obviously, but it has different subsets of it. So some of it's biomedical, some of it's socio-behavioral and educational, right? And so this is going to be, the sort of basic human subject one is going to be one that I think a lot of you are going to want to take a look at. Okay, so a sliding scale. Right, the more your research has the potential to violate personal privacy or potentially violate other things, the more helpful for humanity the outcome needs to be, right? So it's not just that you can always do one thing or you can always do something else. You have to say, do my goals justify whatever it is that I plan to do, right? Okay, so some things to ponder. Again, these bullet points are also from Matt Selganet's slides. informed consent, and informed consent can get very tricky with what that means when you're talking about data from various social media websites, right? So informed consent is much trickier than it used to be a half century ago. Understanding and managing informational risk. This is how you store the data, for instance, right? There's a famous incident from, I think it was UNC, where people's social security numbers were released from a medical study because someone was not secure enough with a hard drive. They didn't do it on purpose, but they weren't secure enough in how they stored it. So you also have to say, this is how I will store the data. This is data that I will potentially delete when I'm done with the project. You know, various things to protect things from a more security standpoint. There's the issue of privacy, making decisions in the face of uncertainty. You know, you're doing the best you can, but you know, when you're thinking about these things, okay, put yourself in other people's shoes. Would you want them doing it to you? Would you want someone to, I think the classical one is, would you want someone to read about it in the newspaper the next day? Which we can replace as, do you want a Twitter thread about what horrible thing that you've done? Is probably the more modern version of that. But you know, what would you feel if you were reading about this in the papers, as it were? Again, think of it as continuous rather than discrete, and going back to the sliding scale. What are you doing that's potentially an issue, and what is the goal of the research that you're going to do? So is it worth that risk or that invasion or whatever it is you're doing? Okay, again, lower bound. Just because you can, right? IRB said you could. Legal permission doesn't mean that you should. And here I'm going to quote Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. If at some other point I give a lecture on chaos, I will instead be slamming him instead of saying good things about what he said. But your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So I want you to always think about if you should. You may well decide that you should, right? The decision is a thing that, you know, people come up to different decisions, but always think about it carefully. Okay, I'm going to pause a bit for some, I think I went faster through that than I intended, but I have too many slides anyway. So I'll pause for some short clarifying questions. And there'll be a second pause later on, by the way.
So as far as I can tell, the chat has been active with some really good discussion, but I don't think there are any clarifying questions. Oh, there's one from Matt Shirley. Is there any inspection or auditing of studies to ensure the researchers follow the measures they commit to follow? Right.
This may depend. I would say that there should be. Now, people do have to report what they've done, right? So someone who has a study then has to say what they did, and if something changed, they have to report it. And if something really needs to change, they have to ask permission for it. That's not the same as auditing, right? Because of course, if somebody's dishonest, they could end up lying about it, right? So this does not do that. I think there can be auditing, but I don't think it happens all the time. But people are always asked to self-report. That's always true.
Another question in chat. What is the role of thinking alone versus talking with impacted people?
Right. That is going to depend on the study. Normally, like the stuff that I've been involved in, for instance, when we've asked questions in the dorm, someone can just choose not to participate, right? Like, so they have to be told in advance, here's what the thing is, here's what you're volunteering to do, and then that's informed consent, right? You give them, you know, all the information, and then they give you consent. I think that what you're talking about on the impacted, I think I have not been involved in studies of that one so much. But there is the notion of informed consent. Yeah, I think I'm going to, unless there's a burning other clarifying one, I'm going to move on to that. Okay.
I'll keep the other questions for the end.
Okay, perfect. All right. So another issue that arises. So there's issue of, you know, ethics to people whose data are involved, but there's also an issue of ethics for data when you're talking about publishing stuff. Right. So at a generic level, even before sort of humans are involved, right? So you need enough and sufficiently precise detail for people to be able to reproduce your work. So this could mean putting things in a public repository, which ideally is the best thing if you can, giving enough detail. So for things like differential equations, you give, you know, your equations and your initial conditions and your approximations and so on, and you do the best you can. But people are human and they may mess up. Having the code available online if you can, is good. Having the output of specific experiments from the paper, even like, outputs of, say, a differential equation solver, is also good, because then they can see exactly what was in the figures, again, when it's possible. I know there are various reasons that sometimes it's not always possible. If for some reason something goes wrong, as in you have forgotten to be precise about something, when someone who is then looking at your work emails you, answer them, respond, and so on. I have many times, and various collaborators of mine, many times we've looked through a paper and we find something, we don't actually know exactly what the model is. We try, we can't quite figure it out, or their implementation, and we email them and we get no response. And I mean, I'm not talking about like, okay, there's reasonable timescales to expect. I mean, just they don't bother. And then it's frustrating because like you get a referee report that says, okay, compare to X paper, and you do the best you can to compare up to what is published. So people make mistakes and they may forget to give something, that's precise, but then, be responsive later on when you're asked. Okay, so to the extent possible, and the reason I'm putting qualifiers like that is that there's also going to be an issue with human data where that will not always be possible. Right, it's not going to always be possible to post data of this type for these types of projects, because then that would violate informed consent or privacy or whatnot. So to the extent possible, you should do it. Put your data up, put usable and well-commented code. There is a tension between those ideals and the notion of personal privacy and non-disclosure agreements and so on. Right, so there's a tension. You're not going to always be able to do everything of all of it. That won't be possible. Synthetic data is easier in a sense, right? Because you don't have humans there, so you can put up the code and you can put up the code to generate the data and the examples. This is where supplementary materials comes in, where Bitbucket and Figshare and various other venues, right? And so even if you're doing very abstract work, right, that's not involving actual human data, but might just be an opinion model that you put on some sort of network of interactions, right? You can do something like that. So you're doing numerical computations, you can still do this. Even in a theorem proof paper, it may still be useful to post stuff, right? So I would say that this is something that's relevant for all of us, wherever we are on the sort of theory and applied and data end. And I've been trying to get better about this over the years. Not as good as I could be, trying to get better. For empirical data, right, there's an issue of whether the data belongs to someone else. So there's an issue of permission to post it, right? So whether it's personal information, whether it's data that was collected in another study, right, or whether it's a non-disclosure agreement, there may be various reasons why you can't do it because it belongs to someone else. So you get permission if you can, if it's something that's kosher to post. And then if you want to look at a certain license, Creative Commons is one particular license that one can put on something that one publishes. And so you can take a look. This is the most common one I've seen. Okay, so the idea of sharing data is related to the replicability crisis, or the so-called replicability crisis, also called the replication crisis. I don't know, people didn't settle on one name. One person whose work you could look at is Victoria Stodden. And so she's been really very active in looking at reproducibility in computational science. And reproducibility is going to be a big deal when it comes to social systems, because you may not be able to post things for privacy. Or if you're doing research that involves Facebook, that's not going to be the same if somebody else is doing research that involves a different social media, but hopefully there's still some notion of replicability, even though the social media are different, or there's something about the social medium that you don't know. I think I have an example of this coming up. Okay, it's not quite on this one, but it will come. All right, so in your papers, right, there's going to be, if you have personal data at some point, there's going to be data anonymization, although that's going to be another thorny one. Data cleaning, sampling, transforming, so be explicit about anything you did on the technical end. Okay, so you say, okay, we sampled this uniformly at random 1 out of 10 or whatever it is, right? Be explicit about it, because this is something that you did and you made a choice, and somebody else might not like the choice, maybe for a technical reason, maybe for an ethical reason. So they should be able to make a different choice. Okay, sampling biases change the properties of data. This is true both at a sort of, say, metadata level. So if you sample in a certain way, demographic properties could get changed. But it's also true at a sort of purely mathematical level, where certain types of probability distributions can be more likely to show up if you sample data in certain ways. So there's an older paper now by Michael Stumpf, where he was showing, and this goes back to the power law controversy that some of you know me for. But what he was showing was that if you sample certain data, distributions are more likely to be power laws if you sample them a certain way. So if you observe a power law, is it because that's what's in the data or because of how you sampled it? Okay, so there are many reasons to make a choice, right? So it's not, and not making a choice is not going to be possible. So in her talk, Al had a question concerning avoiding biases. Well, it's more like managing biases and being aware of what the biases are, because the notion of avoiding them completely is basically impossible. Okay, anonymization. When are things actually anonymous? Is, quote, full anonymization even possible? I don't like the term full anonymization, but people use it. I've seen papers that say, we fully anonymize the data. I look at that and I'm like, bullshit. You did not. Don't claim that. Okay, so from Matt Salganik, anonymization. So let's suppose you have these things over here and you remove the name and you remove the home address and you remove, I forgot which other I can count. Anyway, you remove some others. And so you leave only a subset of the data. Let's say you do that. Zip code versus postal, zip code in the US versus, say, postal code in the UK has a different level of granularity. It's much more granular in the UK. Certain rules, for instance, on IRB, they'll be more stringent if you're sub zip code. That's maybe 10,000 people, I think, right? So there'll be certain rules will be sub versus super zip code can be different from each other. Okay, so anonymized medical records, you might combine them, and this is one of the ways of de-anonymizing that occurs, where you're combining records of different types, and then from the intersection you can start inferring things, sometimes with reasonable fidelity. So, quote, anonymized medical records that only have these things, and voting records, and then, okay, you might be able to figure stuff out by combining data sets. This has happened. This is not just a theoretical thing. I don't know how many of you remember the Netflix contest. There was going to be a second Netflix contest. It got canceled. The point of the Netflix contest was, okay, let's try to increase how successful, how good their recommendation systems are. And so there was a big contest to do it. And there's a Netflix data set that got released that was sampled in a certain way that was not actually posted how they sampled it. There's a longer story about that's more of a side story. And what happened is that there was going to be a second one, but there's a couple researchers, and I guess the Wikipedia entry is going to have the link to the paper that did this, but they basically combined the Netflix release data with data that they, I want to say scraped, but anyway, acquired from IMDb, and they outed someone as homosexual with some high probability based on movies that were being tagged with certain scores and whatnot. And that person was fired. And he was not someone who was out, and that person was fired. And essentially it was like, well, I was outed by this study and I was fired because of this. And so there was a lawsuit that kind of arose from that. This is the very short version, but this is kind of an incident that led to Netflix not having the prize. You can combine data sets and you can figure stuff out. So that's a very big concern. This one's a bit of a side point, but one of the ones I want to mention is the top part. If you have sources of data, you need to acknowledge them. And if part of it is a matter of giving credit where it's due, right? So if it's public and they can get it, and you just, you cite it and you just say that, but you may be using data that someone cannot use for whatever reason. So what you do in that kind of case is say, okay, I received this data from this organization. Here is their generic procedure on their website to ask them for data, right? So you give a comment like that. Okay, so a couple other things to think about. And yes, I'm doing whirlwind style because that is my style. So there's also research and collaboration with companies or say government agencies or whatnot. And there's going to be an issue of what is okay to include in a publication or post online. And they're going to have their own views. Their lawyers are going to have their own views. I've collaborated with companies. It can get tricky in terms of what people are going to allow. So there's also a matter of what companies want, even beyond what's invading people's personal privacy and whatnot. There's also non-disclosure agreements and that. So there's an automatic tension. The tension is always there between open data and personal privacy if you're talking about human beings, right? Humans are not particles. And so you need to think carefully each time. There's also terms of service agreements and non-disclosure agreements. I can tell you a hilarious story about how actually the AMS was telling Oxford that they might cancel their subscription to like what's called the mathematical reviews because of some scraping. So there's also a matter of even data that's been collected and what are the terms of service and so on. Okay, so in what sense can you replicate work if you can't post everything, right? Applications in the social sciences, this is not physics, right? It's not physics. It's not even biology usually. So how do you replicate something if some things have to remain private? So if you've figured out that it's okay to do it in the first place, right, which is already an issue, if you figured out it's okay to do it, but you can't post certain things because then that would be a problem, even though doing the calculations and research is perhaps okay, how do you replicate work? Because we still want something that's scientific. So there are notions of softer replication. I don't know if that's the official term, but the idea is that the results should not depend on the precise things that you did, on every last thing that you did, right? The results should not depend on that. Otherwise, they're probably not robust, right? If I'm studying how people interact on Facebook, I could potentially study something about Facebook, or I could study something about humans. Now, I personally am usually interested in stuff about humans, although given what Facebook is doing to democracy, maybe we're also interested now on Facebook per se. But the point is, if it's about humans, it should be true not only on Facebook, but should also be true on other social media. So it shouldn't depend on the precise things that were chosen, but should also be able to be, you should see some phenomena elsewhere. And that's not the same as a classical physics experiment. Okay, so is it about behavior or is it about the network? And how can you handle some kind of replicability there? Okay, so replicating scientific results when part of the algorithm must remain private. Must remain private, in this case, might come from the company. And there's a particular paper where this was a big deal. So this is by Eitan Bakshi, Salman Messing, and Litt, and this is a paper that appeared in Science a few years ago, and this is about exposure to ideologically diverse news and opinion on Facebook. They know the Facebook algorithm. The Facebook algorithm doesn't these days show you everything in your feed. It is sampled. We don't know how it's sampled. Some people who are doing research on it may not know how it's sampled, or even if they do, as in the case of those three, since they all work at Facebook, they cannot tell people how it's sampled when they're making parts of data public for their paper, right? So the notion of anyone who's replicating it doesn't know the sampling. How do we replicate a study like that? So my view on there is that, do their insights apply to other online social networks, and to try to distinguish between what might be a result of Facebook sampling, which has only gotten more controversial in the last several years, right? 2015 was kind of before the current stuff. But there should be some notion of weaker form of replication so that maybe the most interesting qualitative results will still be there. Then there's also the issue, what about the work being public at all versus entirely within Facebook, right? I'm sure there's a lot of studies that we don't know about that just were either done privately and never intended to be public, or were not approved to be public, and so on, right? So there's also the matter of the ones that we see are the ones that were approved to be public or somehow got leaked or whatnot in the first place, right? So there's also that. Another controversial one was concerned with manipulating people's emotions in a Facebook study. This one got quite a bit of play in kind of the standard press. So there's a bunch of articles about that. And there were experiments on Facebook with changes in people's feeds. Again, the work being public. So this is work that was in a paper, so it was publicly known, but you can imagine there's a ton of this stuff that's not publicly known. The academic researchers, and these were folks at least they were at Cornell for most of the study. I think a couple like graduated and moved to different universities by the time it got published, but they had an IRB that they needed approval of before it started. Facebook has a publication review board to approve publication of a study after it's been done. So there's a difference in the approval mechanism in the company versus in the university. Okay, so in any event, this one is a controversial one from a few years ago. I guess compared to current controversies, it seems much milder than the stuff we've seen the last couple of years, to be honest. Not that that excuses it, but just things have just gotten worse. Anyway, take a look at the articles on this one. You can see what people wrote. Okay, then that also leads to a question. Should academic researchers and companies follow the same rules? Right, it's very natural to ask that question. There's also the what rules should they follow? Okay, so I'm going to pause again for short clarifying questions.
I think this one is a clarifying question. Why does my work need to be replicable to be ethical?
So I would say to be scientifically ethical, this is for scientific ethics rather than human ethics. You want other people to be able to, under the same conditions that you have, to be able to do this, to be able to get the same result. I mean, to me, that's a standard part of science. It's just there's a tension for social systems where even having the exact same results may not be possible. But this is scientific ethics rather than human ethics.
I think the other questions I have I'll save for the end because they're less clarifying.
Okay. All right. So in some sense, you can think of, and I do think of it this way, of data science and machine learning and so on as, nuclear weapons of the 21st century. And part of this is in terms of issues that we're being forced to confront, that yes, we should have confronted them earlier, but now we're really being forced to confront them. And to me, I see a parallel between what was happening before. Okay, so again, Ian Malcolm plays a role here. There's a well-known book that covers certain parts of this, certainly like the algorithmic bias parts of this, Weapons of Math Destruction, which I know is a popular book. So that's one place you could look for some examples. I was trying yesterday and I couldn't find it to find a particular study where it was interesting because the study was done. It was an anthropological study, and it was done with. It was using some data from kind of some tribal data, but then the researchers had a they had an epiphany and they were kind of really thinking about things. They actually withdrew the paper at page proofs after it was accepted because they felt that they had not gotten sufficient permission as concerns informed consent with the members of that community. And I don't know the details of it. And I was trying to give a hyperlink to a thread because there was a nice Twitter thread by one of the authors of that paper that really went into detail about why they did this and what they were thinking of. And I unfortunately could not find it. But if you're able to find that, that would be an interesting example in terms of some food for thought. And apologies for not being able to find the study I was looking for. There's also something called deep fakes. If you want to learn more about that, there is a white paper from Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics from a workshop from a year ago now, and that will only make things worse. So so if you want to think about deep fakes, although the example I'm going to give you is actually a glorious example, but it's concerning. There is a recent cover of Nothing Compares to You by Golem. which includes video and audio and so on. And this was done in an algorithmic way. So you can also imagine, especially when in a sort of political arena, imagine that there's a video that's released of some politician admitting to a crime, but the video is not them actually doing it, it's a deep fake. And it becomes harder and harder to figure out if a video is like authentic or if it's faked, because the method of faking it becomes more and more sophisticated, right? So this is something to look forward to, as it were, because this is only going to make things worse. You should actually look at the goal cover, though. That's actually great. Okay, so I also want to mention algorithmic bias. Just from the Wikipedia page, and I don't know if that's the official definition, but it seemed reasonable enough, so I want to use it, describes systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes, such as, say, privileging one arbitrary group of users over others. And I think if we've seen, various things in the news, there we see, it's like every day there's a new example of this, pretty much. So my standard hashtag, what could possibly go wrong? A couple of many examples. So one of them from a few years ago was Microsoft Twitter's racist hate bot. And what they did is that they decided that they would put a bot on Twitter that would interact with people and learn from those interactions. So immediately what happened is that the trolls went after it and taught this bot to basically within an hour be just to utter this horrible stuff, right? And so Microsoft had to take it down. I kind of found it hard to believe that they would not have tested that beforehand, that people would do that. But anyway, that's one example from a few years ago. More recent, told you my buddy would show up. So Stanford had an algorithm for who gets a COVID-19 vaccine in their first batch. And what ended up happening, and I'm going to show you one of the headlines and a couple other things, right? So basically, it was, people who were not patient-facing were getting a lot of priority over people who are patient-facing, where it's like, well, if you're facing patients, I think the people who are facing patients should probably be getting vaccinated very early. And then this one's saying 7 out of the first 5,000. So they were relying on an algorithm, and then I think the official line, I don't remember the quote, was, oh, it was just the algorithm, but of course you have some sort of bias in the data that gets inside, and you put it in an algorithm that's a machine learning algorithm that you have very imperfect understanding of, if almost any understanding at all, and so it then gives you a biased output. Okay, so Daniel Litt, who's a mathematician who some of you know, and this is a very, very popular meme. It got liked a lot. So Heather's the one who showed this to me. It's a very popular meme. It got liked a lot. So maybe you may have seen it. So there's the trolley problem. So the trolley problem was invented by philosopher Philip Foot and was named by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. You can look them up. They're both interesting. And the idea is that you've got a trolley and there's a switch, and you're currently on track to run over 5 people, but should you pull the lever, then you can run over 1 person. And then Daniel's meme, which was in response to the Stanford thing I mentioned before. Okay, you're responsible for programming the algorithm, so maybe that absolves you of responsibility or something. Okay, so what that reminded me of when Heather showed me his meme. So for those of you who know Tom Lehrer, we have had discussions like this before. A different context, and this is also why I do the analogy to the nuclear weapons. So this comes from his song Werner von Braun, right? So once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? And actually, say rather that he's apolitical is also language that people use in some of these discussions. So anyway, these are in a different arena, but these discussions have occurred before. Okay, I am running. I have a little bit more time, I suppose. There's a Medium article by Johan Ugander. This is from a few years ago, from before most people heard of Cambridge Analytica. And when I actually showed this slide to my students in my course a few years ago, at the time, I think almost no one in the room had heard of Cambridge Analytica. That's of course changed. And this had to do with kind of targeted advertisements, say in the 2016 presidential campaign. Anyway, you can look at what Johan wrote about that. There's a website calling bullshit. I'm probably going to set the record for most swears in talks these few days. There are many great things about this course. This is Carl Bergstrom and Devin West. Lots of great reading material. And there are various parts that relate to ethics. So here's a direct hyperlink to those parts. Carl Bergstrom often, especially now with COVID, often tweets about ethical things as well. So this is another source that you may want to look at. When I showed a version of these slides a few years ago to Johan Ugander, he also suggested a few papers. This now gets a little bit more specific. There's been a lot more work in the computer science literature, especially at like AAAI conference and things like that, than there has been from mathematicians. There was targeted advertising for the movie Straight Outta Compton, which and so this is a Business Insider article, and the targeted advertising depended in part on the expected prior familiarity with the rap group NWA. So like if certain people were expected to be very familiar, then maybe there was one sort of way of pitching the advertisement, otherwise not. There are papers by so Arvind Narayanan, and apologies if I messed up the pronunciation. I think he was at Princeton at the time these papers were published, and collaborators. So about online tracking when you go on websites. I showed you an example earlier today, right? I was actually looking up data ethics courses on websites of universities and getting targeted advertisements for programs at those universities. There's also, you can use network data. So this is something I have not stressed this time, but when I give this talk to my networks course, I stress the network aspects a bit more. The network connections contribute to this. The IMDb versus Netflix was basically drawing edges, which in my language I would call interlayer edges between IMDb and Netflix. You can use, when you combine data sets, you can do things like that, or even you can use social network information, and that can also influence how and what can be de-anonymized. So network data itself provides a coupling that can also do more things. These next two are about spam and when is spam worthwhile in terms of the hit rate of how often somebody actually clicks on something or buys something. So these are conference proceeding, or these three are conference proceeding papers in computer science conferences. There's some other studies. Taste, Ties, and Time was a study with Facebook data from Nicholas Christakis that had some controversy at the time. There's also been work by political scientists, social scientists, Sinan Aral, and collaborators on various things on manipulation and voting on social media sites. So one thing that they found, this is a popular article about it rather than the technical article, but I remember seeing Aral talk about this years ago, is that let's suppose you allow both upvotes and downvotes. If I go and I seed an upvote, right? So, someone about the short course makes a comment that, okay, Mason Porter's talk is really good, and I give an upvote, my initial upvote can actually cause about a 30% increase in upvotes overall at the end just by having seeded it. Whereas downvotes, what they found in Aral's paper, tended to get reversed. So that you can seed, by putting in upvotes like artificially, you can actually seed how much things get at the end. And if that becomes a sort of currency, you can imagine that then becomes another thing that people manipulate. So this study is about that. Although there are some ethical questions that one can ask with that study, because what they were doing in their experiments was seeding with false upvotes and downvotes on Yelp and on, I forgot the other one, on Reddit maybe. Yeah, Reddit. Okay. Okay, so some conclusions. I'm actually going to be mostly on time. Mathematicians are relatively new to using human data, but this is not going to decrease, and the ethics training desperately needs to catch up with that because there are a lot of issues and we need to think about it. So these courses need to be available, and we need to make ethically informed decisions. And I recognize different people are going to make different decisions, but whatever they are, they need to be informed. There are other disciplines that have been doing this for a lot longer than we have, and so we should learn stuff from them. And read about and discuss and think about various controversies, other studies. I hope I've pointed you to a few that that you'll find interesting and helpful to read. So there's a sliding bar. Different people set their bar in different places. I understand that. But the more potential for issues such as invasion of personal privacy, the more potential there has to be for the outcome. Curing cancer versus finding a phase transition, there's a difference. And again, IRB approval, I just want to remind you again, is a lower bound only, right? That just means legally you can do it. Doesn't mean that you should do it. And then just to, an applied mathematician's apology, I am very much an amateur on this. I know much more about other things like networks and stuff. So I'm really an amateur, and I want you to read the people who I pointed to, because these are ones who think about this a lot. And it's important that we have people who think about this a lot. And so you should see what they have to say. But I still hope you found it useful. Or I also hope you found this presentation useful. And with that, I will close and take some of the questions.
Right, so I think I'm going to start with the questions that haven't been answered in chat in some way, but I will be forwarding any questions that we don't get to, including ones that were discussed in chat, to Mason after this. So the first one is this. In political situations, such as the handling of COVID data, privacy restrictions seem to be used to hide data. An example is using HIPAA compliance to hide zip codes and geolocation of testing and incident results for COVID. Do you have thoughts on this?
Okay, right. I was wondering what the question was. It's thorny. That's the thing. That's the thing with these things, right? I don't know if I want to give an off-the-cuff answer to that. I think that's something we do need to think about. I'm not surprised that people have been doing that. Yeah, I think I want to take this one offline, I think, if that's all right.
Okay. From Ben Braun, do you have suggestions for productive ways to generate discussions about ethics with mathematicians, especially pure math researchers?
Right. So one of the things I'm hoping is that, well, maybe even the video of this talk when it's up, but some of the resources that will be there. And I know I saw that you and a couple others were discussing sort of small units for your courses in the Slack. What I've done is this slide deck is an adaptation of something I've showed in courses. I study human social data a lot, so it kind of shows up very naturally. I think for the people who are on more theoretical mathematics, it might be good to have a small snippet of something that's from a more applied paper. So do it in the context maybe of a research paper that was done and actually discuss a research paper. And depending on the topic in mathematics, it might be a research paper that uses ideas from that topic, but then you shift the focus to ethics and use the sort of mathematical topic they're familiar with to do that. I mean, in graph theory, of course, it's sort of evident you can jump from graphs to networks to data very easily. I think that you were mentioning a number theory course in the Slack. So in that context, maybe a cryptography example might be appropriate there. But you have different topics that people know and use that as a starting point to try to find an example, say paper or so on, that uses that and as a springboard. That's how I would try it anyway. That would be a good one to discuss, because I mean, I'm from applied mathematics, and I think that the way to bring in the issue is going to be slightly different. Thank you for that question. It's really good.
Another question, to what extent is it the responsibility of the researcher to verify the ethics of third-party data?
Right. This is also going to, every question is going to be tricky. You do the best you can with it. I think that you need to talk to the people who collected the data, but in many cases, it will not even be possible for you to verify it, because you might end up, there might be a data set, say, that's provided to you if you're talking about a collaboration. I mean, ideally you have this as a collaboration, but there might be a data set that's provided to you, and you may not have the ethical right to even do that investigation of checking that data in the first place. And so then it's a matter of, well, what will that collaboration benefit, say, to humanity? So if you can do it, you should, but I anticipate that there's going to be huge numbers of times when it's not going to be possible.
Predictive policing algorithms are also often proprietary and very susceptible to a sort of spiraling bias, where the bias of historical data influences enforcement, which influences the new data inputted into the algorithm. Do you have any thoughts on specific data ethics concerns where the results of a model will influence the data being inputted into future models?
Right. So one thing that, I mean, of course, there needs to be more research on algorithmic bias anyway. I personally tend to not like black box algorithms because I just get frustrated by not understanding them. And then, of course, if the black box algorithm is then producing something that's biased, yes, you get spirals. I don't think you should just have an automatic feedback loop that you don't want to just have an automatic feedback loop without, like, researcher checking and or company or whoever checking in the beginning with, right? So I would say to not even have a feedback loop to begin with. Yeah, I mean, it's the past data definitely influences a lot. You have to check it. There's also, you can do things like auditing. I don't know if they check the feedback loop when auditing, but you can do things like auditing algorithms. So have somebody else use the algorithm, but not on that data, but on a different data set to try to see if they find feedback loops on other sort of realistic data that's not real. And if you have another person do it, then that might actually also be good in terms of sort of scientific biases. And so then they might alert you to an issue that you don't notice. There's going to be a lot of I don't know answers. I'm sorry. This is very difficult.
Is there any attempt nationally or internationally to standardize across these IRB type standards, even in its infancy?
Oh, no. There's no way if they're doing that, good luck to them. There's an XKCD about this, by the way. If there's any attempt, I don't know about it, and I think it's a pipe dream.
Sort of earlier conversations about replication and replication on social media. Should researchers replicate their own work on multiple social media platforms? So, for example, demonstrate themselves that the results do not depend on the social media platform as a condition of publication?
I don't think it should be a condition of publication, because I think it's a condition that's going to always be impossible to do. If you have a collaboration with a certain platform, you may not have access to the data for others. What I think you do have to do is be extremely cautious about your conclusions, but that condition is almost never going to get met.
Have you thought about lack of explainability? I personally worry about deep learning algorithms making adverse decisions. Would an applicant have gotten into Harvard if there was just one more hidden layer?
Right. Yeah, I worry about algorithms making decisions too, hence the what can possibly go wrong hashtag. I don't like black boxes. I mean, of course, this is me as a mathematician with my bias. I mean, in computer science, anyway, if you think things are rough on these things in the mathematics literature, you should look at the computer science literature. But yeah, I agree with you, but I don't want the algorithm making that decision. I actually think that humans being intelligent about it and trying to see things that algorithms are not going to be able to find, and not trusting algorithms too much, is kind of where I mostly sit on things like that.
Do you want to share any thoughts on the ethics of scientific reporting, i.e. lying with statistics? For example, how AstraZeneca combined their results and reported effectiveness.
Okay, so I haven't looked at the AstraZeneca stuff sufficiently to comment on them per se, but yeah, this is sort of the, when you're reporting something, that's why I'm like, be honest about what you do, and that's supposed to be obvious, but then people, people face pressures and then they exaggerate, and exaggeration sometimes can be merely annoying or merely bad science, and sometimes exaggerating can be downright horrible. So I think that goes into the, you need to be honest about things, but you should also, but honesty is not just, not lying is not the bar of where honesty is, right? Like, you give the state of play of what the actual state of play is, you indicate the weaknesses, you indicate the strengths, you indicate the uncertainties, and you do the best you can to be really, rigorous about, not just, proving theorems, or not just, the actual attempt to make the science as good as possible, but be rigorous about how you state the results too.
Okay, and this will probably be the last question before the break for time reasons. What are the ethical responsibilities of a researcher who is publishing a finding on an exploitable loophole / bias in existing systems and institutions?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
A clarification to that question, seeing as how that result can then be exploited by others until it is mitigated.
Right. Well, so actually, it's interesting that you bring that one up, because I would argue that the IMDb Netflix thing, being able to combine them, is an example of that, right? Because that came from an academic paper initially. So publishing loopholes is a tricky thing, right? So this is another one you have to decide, think about it. Should I publish the loophole to inform people and get it fixed? Or should I first, for instance, contact the people who created the loophole and try to get the loophole fixed, right? To do something, don't point to the problem so that people can then exploit it, but do something that helps the problem get fixed. Yeah, I mean, I think I would try to err towards, contacting it and trying to actually fix it before you point to everybody, oh, here's something that's bad. It's like, well, great. Now they know it's there and they can exploit it. And the fact that you pointed to it may have done more damage, or often does do more damage than the thing that there was a problem in the first place.
All right, thank you, Mason. I'm going to send any remaining questions and then all of the questions I've already asked to Mason in case your question hasn't been answered yet. And thanks everyone for coming. We're gonna have another short 30-minute break before the small group discussions. And again, if you're not going to be part of those discussions, but want to talk to other people, please do feel free to organize on the Slack or the Discord. Thanks everyone.